Um, hey, it's the weekly roundup. I am Dave Dayen, executive editor of the American Prospect, and we do this every week. Bring on a different member of the staff to talk over the week's news. And this week we have Bob Kuttner, co-founder and co-editor. Bob, how are you doing?
Doing well, except for the country.
Except for the country. Except for the country. I know. I keep using the phrase "How are you doing?" and that is the response that I typically get from most folks. Uh, it was, I mean, I think it was a week where we saw the continuation of many of the horrors that we've seen here in the first month of the Trump presidency, but we've also seen some fault lines begin to emerge. So maybe we should start with the bad before we go into the good, maybe, or relatively speaking. Um, you have been focused on, I think, what is the big news of the week, which is the beginning of these talks around the war in Ukraine and the way in which Donald Trump has really taken the posture of Vladimir Putin and his side of the debate in these talks, which don't even include Ukraine, apparently. So, I know you've been following that, so talk about that.
Well, I think we all know what Trump has done. I think the two interesting rings of this circus are Europe and, more importantly, at home, which Republican senators are pushing back. And I think we've seen more pushback by Republican senators in this area than in any other area of Trump access. So we've had Thune and Tillis and
Mm-hmm.
Murkowski
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
Kennedy and Cornyn and Curtis and Kramer, among others, all saying they disagree with Trump that Zelensky was the aggressor. They disagree in his characterization of Putin. And some of these uh, guys have committee chairmanships. I don't think you can stand that degree of defection. And given all the ways that Trump can hurt these guys, if you have a critical mass of Republicans saying, we don't care if you're threatening to hurt us, this is just wrong, that's a breakthrough. That's something
Mm-hmm.
new. We've seen one-off, Murkowski here and Collins there, but this is a critical mass of influential Republicans saying, no, this is crazy. And you have no idea what's going on behind the scenes, what kinds of conversations are being held. That plus the fact that Hedgeseth turns out to be a rank amateur, that Rubio and Vance at various points have been contradicting each other. So this could be a shit show, and not in the way that Trump intends. Now, I don't want to be overly optimistic here, but I think it's a beginning of the crack in the consensus that Trump has been able to enforce. What do you think?
Yes. So I think that in seeing this pushback, it seems to me that we were thinking about how the sequence of events was going to run in the wrong manner. So what Democrats were out there saying is, you know, stand up for your institution. Donald Trump is closing federal agencies. He's pausing federal programs that were appropriated by you. Uh, when is a Republican going to speak out? As if that's the first thing that would happen. But the first thing that would happen is Donald Trump would lose support in the country, lose support of the public. And that would create space for Republicans and whoever to distance themselves from the president. As long as Donald Trump was at 53%, nobody was going to abandon him on the Republican side. He's now at 45, and it's been a rapid drop. And we saw a lot of polls this week that showed this. And if you're talking on specifics, particularly on economic sentiment, he is at a lower point economically than he was at any time in his first term. He is at a lower point on inflation than Biden was. I believe 32% on inflation. And this is what it was going to give the space to the various forces on the right who are available to make that distance. So it's not just Ukraine either, although that's important. There's a ton of pushback from House Republicans who don't want to be fed into the wood chipper on having to pass this budget that cuts Medicaid in particular. There are a lot of Republicans from rural states, rural districts that rely on Medicaid. Josh Hawley has spoken out about this as well. And they're going to be hard pressed to pass that budget resolution next week. Even Collins has come out and said, yeah, it's unconstitutional. It took her a month, but she has now said, yes, it's unconstitutional to take spending that I, as the chair of the Appropriations Committee, passed and just cancel it out. So there is this seeming reckoning here, and it's all because you actually do, like it may not seem like the rules of political gravity are operative anymore, but you do need the consent of the governed in order to, especially when you're trying to do something pretty radical, the way that Trump is. And he lost that because he lost sight of what he ran on and what the American people want. He did not run on the Gulf of America, right? He did not run on DEI, which in one poll polls about 15 points higher than Elon Musk. He did not run on these issues. He ran mainly to restore the economic conditions of 2019, and he can't do that, and he hasn't done that. And I think there is a rapid loss of interest in the program that he's doing that is not commensurate with what his promises were.
Well, I also think it's his recklessness and his impulsivity and his nihilism. That is to say, if he had done a more temperate version of what he's doing and had even minimal consultations with key leaders in Congress, he could have gotten away with about three-quarters of the stuff that he's doing. But it's the completely gratuitous stuff that steps on the toes of influential Republican legislatures, that hurts their constituencies, the kind of across the board cuts in grants and aid that help Republicans as well as Democrats. And you reach a critical mass, it seems to me, and we're very close to it, of Republican Congress people and senators giving each other permission to say,
Right.
wait a minute, that's nuts. And we're very
Right.
close to that.
We are. Now, I think we need to make a distinction, though, when we say this. That doesn't mean that Trump is going to stand down or that there's going to be a caretaker presidency for 3.5 years, right? We're still going to get a lot of bad stuff, and some of the worst is going to be in deregulation and simply lack of prosecutorial enforcement of anything. Just today, we saw the Justice Department drop a case against SpaceX. Who's the head of SpaceX, right? Just in the last week, we saw this crooked deal between the Trump Justice Department and Eric Adams, which I know you're writing about in terms of Kathy Hochul's decision, the governor of New York, who has the ability to actually remove mayors within the state of New York, but chose not to in the specific case of Adams. There's been a lot of deregulation by purge, right? If you fire everybody at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, there's going to be deregulation of consumer financial markets. If you fire a bunch of people at the EEOC, there's going to be deregulation of anti-discrimination cases. We're still going to have all of that. There's no paradise coming, but the ability to do things that are completely beyond the pale, I think there are limits.
Well, and the political antibodies kick in. And part of this is the Republicans. We can also talk about the courts. But I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the critique of the Democrats. I mean, the standard press line is that the Democrats have been gobsmacked. They're flat on their back. They're divided. They don't, they don't have any kind of a strategy. And people ask me all the time, well, what should the Democrats be doing? I'm sure they ask you as well, David. And this is not easy because they don't have either house of Congress. And the best that I could come up with, and this is an idea that's been floating around on social media that I did my own version of the other day on my on tap
Mhm.
newsletter, is
Yeah.
pick a spokesman du jour and have one key talking point. And it's not about, alas, it's not about the Constitution. It's about how Trump is screwing you. Trump said he was going to do X. He's really doing Y. This is how it hurts you. He's taking away your Medicaid so he can pay for the tax cuts of billionaires. He's doing this deal with Putin so that he can get mineral rights. I mean, it's simple, straightforward talking points. It's mostly going negative on Trump in a coherent way because you can't, the Democrats are not going to be able to agree on an affirmative policy. Where would be the venue where the Democrats could say, yeah, we're going to do Medicare for all, or we're going to do universal free college tuition, or no, that's not credible. The press would leap all over that. But at least they can be more coherent in their messaging and their talking points on Trump, and you put your best people forward, you put your most articulate people forward. You have one press conference every day with one clear talking point. And I think getting away from this media cliche that, the Democrats can't do anything right, that's very important. And the way to do that is to start doing a few things right.
Well, I talked to some Senate sources this week, and they would tell you that that's exactly what they're doing. And one of the things they pointed to, I think, in some ways reinforces your point, and in some ways shows why the entire messaging system needs to be rethought. And if you looked at so there was a budget resolution that passed at 4:46 in the morning last night in the Senate, and the budget resolution. I don't know if we want to get into the whole thing of one bill versus two bills, but there's this situation where Senate and House are operating on different tracks and passing different kind of budget resolutions. This one in the Senate would increase spending by about $350 billion, mostly for the border and for the military, and it would be offset by some energy programs like increased royalties, as well as maybe some cuts to IRA programs. And when you do a budget resolution, as you know, as someone who served, in the Senate, there's a vote-a-rama, where basically any senator gets the ability to have an amendment. They get, a very short amount of time to debate it, and then they do a vote. And it's very pro forma because, nobody wants to mess with the budget resolution. So all of the votes inevitably go in the direction of the majority party. But there are a lot of messaging amendments that go forward. And every one of those, they reflected the spirit of exactly what you were talking about. Republicans voted yesterday against, cuts to Medicaid. They voted against improvements in healthcare. They voted against. They voted against a proposition that said we don't want to give one dime to billionaires, and then it was like $10 billion a year, or whatever it was. So the entire idea is to bring everything back that is happening to the tax cuts for the rich. And so they're doing that. But, I don't know exactly who was sitting around as a swing voter waiting to hear at 3 in the morning last night that Republicans voted against some bill that was meaningless anyway, like a pro forma piece of amendment
No, but then
on a budget resolution.
but you turn it into a talking point. So when you have your press conference this week, and it's Pete
Yeah.
Buttigieg, or it's Gretchen Whitmer, it's Jamie Raskin, whoever you think your most articulate spokesperson is, you said, "Hey, did you know that the Republicans voted against a resolution or an amendment to protect your Medicaid?" I mean, it's that sort of pivot.
Yeah. Yeah, so they had that, and I think that is generally the message that I see. Most Democratic representatives putting forward is that they want to cut your food and medicine for the most vulnerable and give that money to the richest people in
Yeah,
America. It's
you
a
put
pretty
that in a
simple
bumper sticker.
message. It's and that's why it works. And so I have a you know it's easier to make those messages when the president of the United States looks incredibly vulnerable, and he does at this point. And so I think that is a key to this.
So here's one other example of Trump's impulsivity. So
After that, we're
he
going to get to this question from Deborah, but go ahead.
so he wants to move the Postal Service back into the U.S. government to make it part of the Commerce Department. Now, this is lovely in a couple of different respects. So for starters, the Postal Service never should have been privatized in the first place. It was part of the U.S. government for the first 200 years. It should have remained part of the U.S. government. They privatized it. So now he's going to move it back to the Commerce Department. That means that anytime a post office anywhere closes, it's on him. You can't say, "Oh, I didn't do that. The Postal Service did it, and they're independent." So he's doubly shooting himself in the foot.
Well, I mean, first of all, that's he's talking about doing that by executive fiat, which I mean, Article 1 literally gives uh, uh, the the Congress the power to set postal roads and rates and things like that. So that's not going to happen. I actually see it as part of this flailing. Like if your whole pose is shock and awe, if that's the way in which you are governing in this second term, you have to keep coming up with more and more and more ideas to
Well, and you
continue
run out of
this
you run
impression,
out of you
and you
run out
run
of
out of the
stuff
good ones.
you run out of stuff that's politically popular. You start doing second
Popular
and
and
third
possible.
tier.
Yeah.
You start doing second and third tier shock and awe that looks either stupid or politically
Right.
unpopular or random or flailing.
and and the downside of creating this environment where the only individual that matters in the government is Donald Trump alone, that Congress doesn't matter and nobody else matters, is that anything bad that happens in the country is also on you. So I mean, it's related to what you say. So that's how he gets tarred with the price of eggs and everything else. Okay. So we have yeah, go ahead.
No, we have a question.
Yeah, excuse me. Called this week.
Flu.
So the question's from Deborah, and it says, what is going on with the military, aside from what's been reported about dismissing members of the Board of Visitors, etc.? I'm sorry, Bob. Do you have a good sense of that?
Well, one of the things that's going on, and this is another case of Republican pushback, is he's talking about firing generals and admirals. And you had several Republican senators saying, "Wait a minute, you can't do that. This is not your private army. Under the law, generals and admirals can only be fired for cause." So that could very well backfire. You've also got stuff going on with veterans that could backfire. We've written about this. A third of the civil service are veterans. And if you start randomly cutting the civil service, you're going to disproportionately hurt veterans as well as African Americans. You're also, he's doubling down on destroying the VA. I mean, so to the extent that he messes with the military that has a great deal of prestige, it's another case of overreach and inviting pushback.
All right. Sorry about that. I had a little thing.
Happy to fill it.
I have I have been a little under the weather this week, but the interesting thing I was going to say with respect to that is that so Pete Hegseth earlier this week ordered an alleged 8% cut to the military budget. So now, at the very same time, the Senate debated and passed a budget resolution, which would add $175 billion to the military budget. That wipes away, if you do the math, about 2.5 years of those cuts. So one hand doesn't know what the other hand's doing. Yeah. All right. Eventually, I'm going to come back to life here. But, okay. What else shall we discuss?
Let's talk about two things. I want to talk a little bit about Europe, and then I wanted us to talk about the courts. So, you can have this bizarre situation if Trump really goes further down this road, where Europe ends up increasing the money that it spends on defense to defend itself against an alliance comprised of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And you could end up with Europe filling in Ukraine's defense needs. And of course, the other thing that Trump is doing by being Putin's poodle, he whets Putin's appetite in the Baltics, in Poland, and this strikes at the heart of NATO. So you basically have NATO minus the United States, and it completely reconfigures the balance of power in the world. But Europe is not completely powerless. And this is great unity medicine for Europe. I do think that in the face of the pushback that Trump is starting to get from other Republicans, despite all of his bluster about Zelensky, you could end up with the kind of deal that everybody's been talking about, where, Ukraine gives up something like 20% of its territory, and Europe comes in and guarantees Ukraine's sovereignty. That I think Trump has pushed this too far, and that may be the ultimate deal if he gets enough pushback from Republicans and from Europeans.
I do want to go talk about Europe, but before that, something you just said struck me. This idea of Republicans leading this pushback. As I mentioned, it's like sort of the mood of the country and his approval ratings that trigger this, but it hasn't just triggered it with respect to Republicans. I want to take one case study here. So there's this lawsuit between Trump and CBS, right? And there was this assumption. This is the 60 Minutes lawsuit, a very frivolous lawsuit where they're claiming that there were edits made to the Kamala Harris interview that put her in a favorable light, and they say it was election interference. It's a ridiculous lawsuit. But we've seen several ridiculous lawsuits against Trump settled by the likes of Facebook and others, and X, where they're essentially giving the president of the United States money in a way that is a bribe in all but name. So it looked like CBS was going to go down this road. There was some reporting to that effect, and one of the reasons is that Paramount is in the midst of selling itself to a company called Skydance, which is Larry Ellison's son, I believe, and Larry Ellison is with Oracle. And seemingly to grease the skids to get this merger through, there was a strong belief that they were going to use the lawsuit to sort of pay off Trump as tribute to get this done. That was then. So now what Paramount is talking about is taking that lawsuit to court and getting discovery and trying to get Trump's financial documents. They've said this in news reports and whatnot. That emboldening which is very different than what Facebook did, what X did, what Disney did in the George Stephanopoulos defamation case, which they settled. That is a reflection of where Trump is in the country now. They wouldn't have done that a month ago, but
What do you
now
think
they're.
changed? What do you think changed inside Paramount's calculation?
I think they realize that this guy's not invincible anymore, and I think that just as Republicans saw that as an opportunity to give space where they could distance themselves, I think corporate America is starting to see the exact same trend. And so those tensions are able to play out, much in the way that they did in the first term, where certainly Jeff Bezos tried to fight Donald Trump and many others. So the oligarchy tight sort of coupling that we've had in the first month here of the Trump administration is already going away with the honeymoon. So I think that's a very interesting development, and it reflects what's going on in the country.
Let me push you a little bit on that. So how do you think this is going to affect their merger?
That's a good question, and it leads me to a piece that I wrote this week, actually, which is the fact that Trump's Federal Trade Commission and Justice Department Antitrust Division announced that they would keep in place the 2023 merger guidelines that were written by Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor. And so this is a fascinating development because you have almost nowhere else in the law, certainly, and in policy more generally, where there's been continuity between the Trump and Biden administrations. Maybe you could say on tariffs to a certain degree, but this is the big one. And it was a huge pillar of the Biden economic agenda, was competition policy. And they are keeping those guidelines in place. Now, does that mean that Trump can then no longer weaponize antitrust? No, of course not. But he doesn't need stronger merger guidelines to do that. Like, Trump doesn't care what the merger guidelines are. If he wants to try to meddle, he'll try to meddle. But keeping those in place, it does show that there is a strong faction in the Republicans who are in power right now who are interested in at least having merger guidelines that are not as permissive as the past 40 years. And that's really, really important.
No, I agree. I just in the case of Paramount, I'd feel better when there are 10 of them rather than just one of them. Just yesterday, Booz Allen Hamilton, which had been the lead sponsor of an LGBTQ pride event in DC, announced that it's not going to do it. So the tide is still going in the other direction of corporations, including media corporations that have other business interests, doing whatever they think they need to do to suck up to Trump. So, too, many Paramounts, let's hope.
Yeah, I mean, I think, certainly every company is going to make their own calculation, and there can be some that chase the money rather than any kind of principle.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's not like you're going to see overnight Mark Zuckerberg, renounce everything that he said in the last month or whatnot. But I think it's interesting that you're starting to see these pockets of resistance. Jared asked in the chat, do you think that Musk will pressure Trump to reverse course on the 2023 guidelines? I really don't think so. I think that anything that he, or more to the point, Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or any of those companies that are under current litigation with the FTC or DOJ, anything they could have done, they would have done already, and they weren't able to get it done. And so you have this continuity, and I think what it shows is that there's a new consensus on competition policy in the U.S. It's like any consensus is fragile, sort of, that we've seen over the last decade, but I think you're starting to see a bipartisan consensus that corporations are far too powerful in this economy.
Well, and back to your opening point, Dave, of Trump starting to lose public opinion. One of the biggest single factors that is dragging him down with public opinion is Musk.
Right. That's right. And eventually he's going to figure that out. Question from Sarah Berry. How effective do you think consumer boycotts and buy nothing days will be? I have never been one to believe that consumer boycotts are terribly effective. I think the Tesla boycotts have the potential to be a little more effective for a couple reasons. Number one, those are large purchases. So, it doesn't take that many to lose to have a significant economic effect. And number two, Republicans are already predisposed to not buy electric cars. So Musk's target audience are people that he is alienating on every day. And so I do think that there can be a significant effect there. What do you think, Bob?
Yeah, of course, the problem is that it's a one-day boycott. So sooner or later you have to eat, you have to buy
Right.
stuff. And it's not
Yeah.
like, when I was very, very young, there was a grape boycott to help the farm
Sure.
workers. So if you have a very targeted boycott against non-union grapes or against Tesla or against South Africa for that matter, or against
Right.
BDS, sometimes a targeted boycott can work, but it's the equivalent of a general strike. You really can't have a consumer general strike because it's too diffuse, it's too dissipated.
No gas Thursday usually turns into buy a lot of gas Friday. Exactly. But the one thing that you mentioned, a general strike, and this wouldn't be exactly that, but you start messing with the post office, and one of the most popular and powerful strikes of the last half century was the 1970 postal workers strike, which led to legislation that allowed for that dealt with a lot of their various grievances there.
But you try to close rural post offices, you're going to have the whole Republican House caucus up in arms.
Yeah, I mean, it smacks of desperation, that entire claim, and it was so toxic that in the 11th paragraph of the piece in the Washington Post that came out, the White House said there is no such executive order being planned. So not a lot of people freaking out about that have mentioned that, but that's what it says.
Well, it's so, 6 months ago, when there was still an election ahead of us, there was a lot of talk about Trump and Alzheimer's, or Trump's and dementia. He's no less demented. He's even more demented, and now he has power. So you have this random stuff that comes up like, oh, I'm going to take over Greenland, or I'm going to announce that Nippon is going to take apart ownership in U.S. Steel, just out of nowhere. Well, it turns out, wrote about this, this was news to Nippon. It was news to U.S. Steel. Trump just made it up on the spot in a press conference. And he's so out of his mind that he does this kind of stuff. And then they have to walk it back. And so the public
the
starts.
Gaza thing was the same thing, right?
Yep.
I mean,
And Republican members of the House and Senate start noticing, and it emboldens them. So that's, to me, that's the really interesting story of the next couple of weeks, is to what degree are they going to be emboldened on which issues, and what sort of a constraint against Trump is this going to function as?
Yeah, it's pretty key. Now, I want to bring up a story that I put out on the site today, because I think it's very much up your alley. I think you're going to really enjoy talking about it. And it has to do with electricity markets. But really, more broadly, it has to do with the takeover of a certain kind of economic, technocratic mindset in all aspects of capitalism and all aspects of the country. So, there are basically two kinds of electricity companies. There are publicly owned and investor-owned utilities. And we talked to this guy on the podcast I do, Organized Money, with Matt Stoller. and this guy named Mark Ellis, who was a former utility executive.
Yeah.
And Ellis looked at investor-owned utilities vis-a-vis publicly owned utilities. And what he found over the last 3 years is that electric utilities had investor-owned utilities had raised their electricity rates 49% above the rate of inflation over 3 years. And publicly owned utilities had raised their electricity rates 44% below the rate of inflation. And this was a phenomenon he had never seen before in decades of looking at electricity markets, usually because both public and private utilities have to go to public utility commissions to get their rates blessed, right? Basically the bargain that we have is we give electricity utilities a monopoly over a certain service area, and in exchange, they have very strict rate regulation through public utility commissions. And so why were the investor-owned utilities getting such a sweetheart deal here? Why were they getting to raise their rates drastically higher than public utilities? And it turns out there is basically this secret society. This is the best way I can put it. They are known as it's called SERFA, or the Society of Utility and Regulatory Financial Analysts. So how do they get involved? So when a utility wants to raise their rates, they have a proceeding, they have a hearing at the Public Utility Commission. And they bring in their own experts, and their experts are out of this place, SERFA. And their experts using economic models say, well, we want to raise our rates by X%, and here is why that fits with the just and reasonable rate of return that we want. And, we're covering our costs here, and we're covering our, our cost of capital here, and et cetera. So the models that they're using, they use 4 different models. 2 of them are found nowhere else in finance. No other financial instrument uses these kinds of models. One of the models is called the expected earnings analysis. So think about what that says, the expected earnings analysis. That means that the analysis is, here's what we think you're going to give us as a rate, and we base our numbers on what we want you to give us. It's completely circular. So the other 2, excuse me, the other 2 of these models that they use have been completely corrupted. And here's the crazy part. The ratepayer advocates are using the same experts from this secret society, which was set up by the utilities to train and certify experts in utility regulation analysis. So the advocates, the ratepayer advocates, are using the same people. And whenever they bring in their own independent people who come up with accurate numbers, if those numbers are wildly out of step with the numbers of the utility company, they get thrown out because they're like, oh, well, that's too different. We don't want to use that. What if it's wrong? So it's this crazy situation, and it has led to $50 billion in excess profits per year, according to Ellis's analysis.
So, David, back up 2 steps. Let's look at the history of public power and private power. So public power really goes back to the turn of the 20th century, where you had some municipally owned utility companies. And then, of course, Roosevelt gives it a big boost with TVA and with the Western dams and with rural electrification. But the point is, a municipally owned utility or some other kind of publicly owned utility, this is socialism, by the way, doesn't have any need to make exorbitant profits. Its only need is to cover its cost and be able to reinvest in technologies. And it doesn't have investors to answer to. It has ratepayers to answer to. Whereas an investor owned is sort of a nice, pretty euphemism. They're private companies. and they want to profit gouge as much as they can. So what they're going to do is they're going to find tame experts who they cultivate to give them the numbers that they want. And it's a classic case of why something as basic as a public utility ought to be a public utility. It ought to be publicly owned, where there's no hidden motive to try and gouge the consumer as much as possible. And even though they still have to go through public utility commissions, deregulation of electricity, beginning with Jimmy Carter, is what opened the floodgates to this. I mean, it used to be much more tightly regulated. It used to have a rate of return that was much more tightly governed by the government, where the industry could not just hire its own experts. And it's a
Right.
classic case where sometimes having the public sector do something directly is actually a lot more efficient than just letting the private sector loose, because the private sector is able to complicate things, make them completely opaque and impenetrable for its own advantage so that it can price gouge.
100%. And this is a classic
Yeah.
example of that. And it's so crazy that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which occasionally, when it's does interstate power lines and things like that, does get involved in this sort of rate setting authority, has said that the models used by this society, uh, and I'm quoting, in 2022, they said that the two models that are used nowhere else in finance defy general financial logic. This and yet the states still use them and allow them to be used in their rate setting proceedings. It's absolutely crazy.
Let me bring this full circle to where we started. So this is your bread and butter. It's my bread and butter. This is what I've been doing all my life. I had a piece in the last print issue called Corrupted Capitalism and Dithering Democrats, making the point that one of the reasons why Democrats have not done well is that they don't connect the dots between the kind of thing that you're talking about in this piece, corrupted capitalism, and how the lives of ordinary people are made worse by the reign of the plutocrats. Okay, full stop. At a time when Donald Trump is out of his mind, acting like a full-blown tyrant, trying to destroy the Constitution, how much purchase does this kind of stuff have? So in one ring of the circus, we've got the stuff that you and I have been writing about as long as we've been writing about, which is corrupted capitalism. In the other ring of the circus, we have Trump, who, yeah, is a personal emblem of corrupted capitalism, but he's a lot worse. He's a tyrant. He's trying to steal the Constitution. So I guess my question is, if we gain some yardage on here is yet another way that capitalism is corrupted, is that going to help us in the fight to keep Donald Trump from destroying what's left of American democracy? And if so, how?
Well, give me an easy one. Why don't you?
I think
I
about it all
mean,
the time because you and I both write several times a week.
mhm.
And so I say to myself, should I be doing a classic Bob Kuttner or a classic Dave Dayen piece where I'm talking about here's another way that corrupted capitalism is screwing you? Or is it more important to talk about the more dire menace of Donald Trump?
Well,
And
I think it's
can you
important.
connect the dots between the two?
I think you can connect the dots between the two. First of all, um, what we did talk about earlier is that enforcement has gone completely out the window in this administration. And so all of these instances of corrupted capitalism are going to go unenforced
And
effectively.
do people care about
So
that?
I think people care about being ripped off. Yeah.
Well, then it's our
And
job to connect the dots, right? It's the connection between Trump's personal corruption and how he's corrupting the government and how it screws you, consumer, you, worker.
yeah, I mean, if Tesla is getting away with their full self-driving entity that isn't working properly and leading to motorist accidents and maybe even deaths. And because of his personal relationship with Donald Trump, that isn't being investigated in any way, then there's your connection. I mean, so there are plenty of ways to do that. I do think it's very important. The second thing about this in particular is that it really takes place at the state level, right? These utility rate regulation is a state matter, and states can rewrite these rules to very tightly regulate what the rate of return must be. The conceit of this paper that was that that Mark Ellis wrote is that the rate of return is actually the cost of capital, and that is a very sort of standard way of looking at things. And you can judge cost of capital sort of by stock valuation. And if you look at the stock market, utilities, investor-owned utilities, are doing way better than the market as a whole. And that's a failure of regulation. These are, strictly regulated monopolies, right? Public utilities that are, where their rates are supposed to be set by a public entity. How could they be doing so much better than the stock market unless they're being given excessive windfall profits by a public entity?
Dave, here's the thing that frustrates me as a journalist, as a progressive, as somebody whose bread and butter is this kind of piece. This is really intricate stuff. And, I write a piece about, I don't know, pricing in hospital bills, or I write a piece about Epic systems. It's complicated, it's intricate. And you got to really care about this stuff to sort of follow all the details in the argument and the analysis. And yet the punchline's clear. You are getting ripped off. And so I think it's incumbent on us as practitioners of explanatory journalism to connect the dots between that story and corrupted capitalism generally and Trump. And the failure, by the way, of most Democrats to think like a Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren and to talk more about corrupted capitalism rather than sort of trying to split the difference with corporate America.
Well, it's a decent enough segue to one of our next questions here from Michael Pacifico, who says, what are your views on the stock market and how it seems to be static? I mean, it is interesting that, Trump came in and said, hey, I'm going to give you corporations a big tax cut and I'm going to deregulate so that you don't have to do compliance with pretty much anything. You want to pollute, you want to, get rid of your workplace safety standards, doesn't matter. And the stock market is like that for the last 2-3 weeks. What do you attribute that to?
I think it's a race between their expectations of higher profits and more deregulation and lower taxes on the one side, and inflation spooking the bond market, spooking the Fed, and causing a big time correction on the other side of the equation. And so they're kind of in a wait and see mode. The market is sort of staying put because some buyers see a buying opportunity and other sellers say, this is as high as it's going to go, I'm going to sell. And for the moment, the supply and the demand are in balance. I would be astonished, given what's going to happen with inflation and the bond market, if we don't see a major stock market correction in the next year. I hate to say, I don't hesitate to add, I am not a licensed stock advisor, but that's just my sense as a journalist.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key words are uncertainty and volatility. So, that's what Trump creates almost by his very nature, and that is not necessarily good for equity markets.
And this is what happened just before the crash of 2008. It kept going up until it didn't.
Well, sure. I mean that's true of any stock market correction in history.
But I mean, it's going to be a big one because the market now, in terms of market fundamentals, is more overvalued than it was in the summer of 1929.
But let's talk about why that is. I'm not going to get the number completely right here, but I think it's something like 29% of the S&P 500 is in five stocks, and they're tech stocks, and it's
Yep.
largely because of AI. And Nvidia is another one. If you add them as there's the Magnificent Seven. All of them are in this AI race. And DeepSeek comes out 2-3 weeks ago. The Chinese AI that was trained for a pittance of the money that has been sunk into American AI systems, and it works seemingly just as well. And that has created this real kind of seize up in that, oh wait, do we not need to engage in all of this capital investment? Are we losing this race even though we're trying to dominate it through money? So
Well,
that's, I think, the
here's
big
another
issue, an AI crash.
data point. Until 1982, the stock market rose roughly in proportion to GDP. After 1982, it rose 2 or 3 times as fast as GDP. What do you think happened in 1982? The SEC legalized stock buybacks.
Right.
A lot of this bubble is pumped up by stock buybacks. That's another factor. But you can only pump up a bubble so far.
Just the other thing I would say about volatility is, and it goes back to the thing I was talking about with respect to the restoration of the 2023 merger guidelines. Merger and acquisition activity, which was expected to have this pent up explosion after Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor were thrown out of there. In January, M&A activity was 30% down year over year. And a lot of that is because not of this expected continuity. A lot of that is because nobody knows what's going on. If there's volatility in a market and the price was $70 a share and then it's $100 a share, you can't price any kind of deal. You can't say I'm going to buy it for 80 if it's going to be 70 tomorrow or whatever. So that's kind of my last pitch there. All right, I want to get your thoughts on one last thing, which is, and we got about 6-7 minutes, which is the legislative aspect to all of this. So Trump has kind of governed in ignorance of the legislature entirely. I believe he signed into law one piece of legislation that was the Lincoln Riley Act, which happened, before he even got into office. So really nothing has happened legislatively in the last month. And there are these two competing measures, whether to just do a border and defense and energy bill first and then do taxes later, or to put that all into one bill. What are your thoughts, seeing this process play out over the first month, as to whether there's, what is going to come out of this very narrow House and Senate?
Well, I think eventually they'll get some kind of a budget deal. And I think what ought to give everybody pause is the only way Trump can get everything he wants, which is both tax cuts and some program cuts, but not so many program cuts that it starts becoming politically toxic, like Social Security, is you increase the deficit. And as soon as you increase the deficit, that spooks the bond market, that spooks the Fed. So I don't see any other legislation going anywhere. I think the budget process, at least for the next couple of months, and it may drag on longer than that, coupled with the desire to get a big tax cut, that kind of crowds out everything else. Plus the fact that Trump governing as a dictator really doesn't care about the legislative process.
Right.
So
But here's things that he should probably care about, and it speaks to where the Democrats should go. In 3 weeks, government funding runs out.
Right.
And so that gives an opportunity for some leverage for Democrats, because Republicans historically have had no way on the House side to pass a budget on their own. And obviously need 60 votes in the Senate for that too. So what should Democrats do? In 3 weeks, we have a shutdown. What do they need to ask for?
Block like crazy. And not go along with these tax cuts for rich people and demand no serious cuts in the social programs that we care about. It's not
Do they need
affirmative.
to go beyond that, though? Do they need to demand the restoration of the CFPB? Do they need to demand restoration of USAID? Do they need to demand the continued flow of all appropriated funding from the previous year? What are those concessions that they need? Otherwise, the government will shut down.
Yeah,
Because that's the other thing about Trump being a dictator or whatever is he's going to own that too. If the government shuts down, like he's not in a position where he's like Biden, where he can blame Congress for that.
yeah, I would put that at the top of the list. I've talked to a senior Democratic legislator about this, and this person said this is unprecedented. Normally, you don't try to pile that onto a budget bill or a government shutdown bill, but these are unprecedented times. And the three things that you mentioned, I would put at the very top of the list. So if the Democrats have the nerve to put that into a conversation about the budget, conversation about stopping a shutdown, I think would be a smart thing to do. I think every bit of leverage the Democrats have ought to be exercised, in particular against things that Trump did that are flat out illegal.
Right. And of course, the other big thing is the debt ceiling. That
Yeah.
that is the next piece, which obviously playing with that is like playing with the nuclear codes, but there's there's seriously going to be a discussion about that as well.
Hell, it's like, yeah, all right, you want to shut down the government? How about you shut down the whole government?
Right. Or everything. Um, all right. Well, let's see. I guess that's about the time we have. Bob Kuttner, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.
And always a pleasure to be here. Keep in mind, we're here every week at 12:30 Eastern with a member of the staff. We post these videos up at the website, which is at prospect.org, as you know. And if you want to join our YouTube page, you're on it right now if you're watching this live. If you're not watching this live, this is taped. YouTube page is The American Prospect. And it's at The American Prospect on YouTube. And if you join up, you will get automatically notified when we have a new live stream coming, which, as I say, is every day, every Friday at 12:30 Eastern. So until the next time, thank you very much, and we'll see you later. Have a great weekend.